No organism on the planet exists in isolation. Everything's connected through a food chain. So, Kat, please explain to us how a food chain works. What is it?
Well, simply put, a food chain shows who eats what in a particular habitat.
So give us some examples.
Let's start with grass, which produces seeds. These seeds are eaten by a vole, which in turn gets eaten by a barn owl. So energy flows from the grass to the vole, then to the owl. In other words, from the food to the feeder.
And you mentioned that the grass has energy, so where does it get that from?
Ultimately, the sun's the energy source for virtually all living things on the planet. Green plants harness sunlight to make their own food through photosynthesis, so we call them producers. Every other organism in a food chain is a consumer because they get their energy by eating other organisms. There are several different names we can give consumers.
And what are they then?
Well, first in the food chain, we have primary consumers, and these just eat plants, meaning that they're herbivores. So examples of these might be rabbits, caterpillars, cows, sheep, so on.
And then what?
Well, next up are secondary consumers, and these eat animals, so they're carnivores. And this would include cats, dogs, even lions and the like. Animals that kill for food are called predators, and the animals they eat are called prey.
And are there any other types of organisms in these food chains?
Well, you've got scavengers, and they feed on dead animals. And these are things like crows, vultures, and even hyenas. And you also get decomposers, which feed on dead and decaying organisms, as well as undigested bits of plant and animal matter in faeces. That's poo. Decomposers are usually things like insects and bacteria.
So that's the players in the food chain, but what about the energy? Where does that go?
Energy gets transferred along food chains from one stage to the next, but energy also gets lost along the way.
Why?
Well, it happens because each organism in the chain can't absorb all the possible available energy from the thing it eats. Some of the energy goes into growth and the production of offspring, which obviously can be eaten, but a lot of energy from food is used for movement. It's lost as heat, or it's lost in waste, such as urine and faeces.
And if it is lost, what happens to it?
All the energy that isn't passed along up the food chain returns to the environment in one way or another. For example, lost as heat or in faeces that could maybe get eaten by decomposers.
So if energy is getting lost at every step of the way, that must presumably limit the length of that chain.
You're absolutely right. Most food chains are pretty short. There's rarely more than 4 stages because so much energy is lost at each stage. As well as losing energy, food chains also lose biomass at each stage.
And what's that?
Well, biomass is simply the mass of living material at any stage in a food chain, and we can represent this using a diagram called a biomass pyramid.
And what does that look like?
Well, a biomass pyramid is simply a chart drawn to scale that shows the biomass at each stage in a food chain. The bars become narrower as you reach the top. Let's say we have a food chain that starts with oak trees in a wood, which are then eaten by caterpillars, which get eaten by blue tits, which are eaten by a sparrowhawk. That's the top predator in our imaginary wood. Now, the bar for the oak trees will be the largest, as they have the most biomass. Then there's a smaller bar for the caterpillars, smaller still for the blue tits, and the smallest of all for the hawk. Well, there certainly is, because this issue becomes really important with farming. Obviously, you want your food production to be as efficient as possible. 2 ways to reduce energy loss include preventing animals from moving about too much and also keeping them nice and warm.
And why is that important?
Well, mammals and birds, like pigs and chickens, keep a constant body temperature, and so this means they lose a lot of energy. And they also use energy to move around. So keeping pigs and chickens in warm sheds with a little space to move around makes for more efficient food production. But there is a moral issue here, as it's not really a very nice life for the animals.
So what can we do about that?
We have to try and strike a balance between the needs of farmers and consumers and animal welfare. And it's clear that it's a very complex issue with lots of things to consider, such as cost, quality of the food and animal rights.
Well, let's change tack for a bit and look at some of the maths involved in food production. How can we work out how efficient a farm actually is?
We can calculate something called energy efficiency. Before you start, you need to know that energy is measured in kilojoules. So let's take a bullock, we'll call him Billy. Let's say that Billy's eaten 100 kilojoules of energy in the form of grass. If he excretes 63 kilojoules in the form of faeces, urine and gases, and uses 33 kilojoules in respiration to make energy, that only leaves 4 kilojoules for making new muscle. So that's all the energy that can be passed on to the next step in the food chain.
Doesn't sound like very much, just 4 kilojoules from every 100.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's not that efficient. In fact, if you do the sums, it works out as an efficiency of about 4%.
But presumably some food chains are more efficient than others. They're not all like that.
Yes, food production's more efficient the shorter the chain. Imagine 1 hectare of land. If you keep beef cattle on it, they'll produce 0.3 tonnes of beef, which is about 1,200 steaks. But if you use the same land to grow wheat, you could get 7.5 tonnes of grain, and that makes about 11,500 loaves of bread. So a meat-based diet might need 7 times more land than a vegetarian diet.
So we've looked at food cycles. Let's take a look at another cycle, the carbon cycle. What's that all about?
All cells, whether they're animal, plant or bacteria, contain carbon. This is because they all contain proteins, fats and carbohydrates, and carbon's an essential part of these molecules. For example, plant cell walls are made of cellulose, that's a carbohydrate, while cell membranes are made of fatty molecules called lipids.
But how does that fit into the cycle?
Carbon starts in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. That's used by plants to make sugars that get built into carbohydrates, proteins and fats. Then the carbon's passed along from one organism to another along food chains. It's also lost in waste products or breathed out. And some microorganisms feed on waste or dead animals, absorbing carbon or losing it as a byproduct of respiration. Ultimately, carbon ends up back in the atmosphere again, and that's the carbon cycle.